So 1986 happens, and the DC Universe goes through some big changes. The Crisis on Infinite Earths has just ended, and every major character is rebooted in one form or another. Welcome to the Modern Bat, where we take a look at every year in the Batman comics since 1986. In this video we're going over 1986 and 1987, because the modern era of Batman started in the fall of '86 with the publication of Batman 400 and Detective Comics 567. These books were the last collaborations of the final Batman creative team of the Bronze Age, which consisted of writer Doug Moench, artist Gene Colan, and editor Len Wein. When Denny O'Neil became the new Batman editor, he had to find a new creative team and also a new origin story for Batman. For his first couple of issues of Batman and Detective, Denny got guest writers and artists until he found the perfect creative team for Detective Comics. Mike Barr and Alan Davis took over Detective Comics starting with issue 569. They had worked together pretty well before in Batman and the Outsiders, so naturally their detective stories were quite good, even if the continuity was all over the place. With Detective Comics sorted out, Denny focused on the Batman title to find a good creative team and also a new origin story. Denny hired writer Max Allan Collins, who scripted a couple of stories while Frank Miller and Dave Mazzucchelli worked on the new origin. Rumor has it that Batman Year One was originally going to be a graphic novel set in the same universe as The Dark Knight Returns. However, Denny saw the opportunity to make these the new origin for Batman, and he published Year One as a 4-part storyline that began with issue 404. Apparently, Frank Miller didn't like this, and after Year One, he didn't work in a Batman comic again until the early 2000s, when Denny O'Neil retired. In any case, Year One was an absolute success, and in my opinion, a much better story than The Dark Knight Returns. It redefined Batman for a whole new generation of readers and writers, and it's still the best starting point when it comes to reading Batman. By the early 1987, the new origin of Batman had been told, and they had found consistent creative teams for both Batman and Detective. After Year One ended, Mike Barr and Alan Davis delivered the sequel to Year One in the storyline called Batman Year 2, which has quite some issues beyond the uninspired title. I already made a whole video about the story in case you want to check out my thoughts about it. The only thing I will say is that Year 2 is a poor sequel to Year 1. It doesn't match the tone or feeling of the first one, and the story is not even canon anymore, as years later there were other stories that were better sequels to Year 1. The Batman Annual number 11 was published in April 1987, and it featured the first Batman storyline written by the absolute madman, Alan Moore. The story is called Mortal Clay, and it's just a great story that expands the history of Clayface 3. Now, the Batman Annual number 11 is also important because it marks the first Batman work by the legendary artist Norm Breyfogle. He worked on the backup feature, showing enormous potential for illustrating Batman, which allowed him to become the new artist in Detective Comics after Year 2 was finished. By that time, Alan Davis had abandoned Detective, and he was replaced by Todd McFarlane, a young artist who was making a name for himself in the comic book industry. McFarlane finished the art in Batman Year 2, and quickly went his own way. On the summer of 1987, and with Year 2 finished, Mike Barr created Batman, Son of the Demon, the story in which Batman and Talia have a son together. The graphic novel was illustrated by Jerry Bingham, and it's an interesting story, even if the characterization of Batman is a bit strange. The story didn't do much to change the status quo, and in fact, it was only ignored by everyone at DC. Mike Barr continued working in Detective Comics for a couple more issues, but his time in the sun was coming to an end. Issue number 581 was his last story, and soon Detective Comics found a new and 100 times better creative team. Norm Breyfogle was the main artist, and Denny O'Neil hired Alan Grant and John Wagner, two iconic English writers who started their run in Batman with a bang. Issue number 583 was their debut, where they introduced the Ventriloquist, one of the most prominent Batman villains of the modern era. Their storytelling style, combined with Norm Breyfogle's illustrations, created moody and atmospheric stories, full of expressionism and a sense of grandiosity to them that remains unmatched even to this day. They are definitely one of my favorite Batman creative teams of all time. Grant, Wagner and Breyfogle followed up the ventriloquist with another new character, the Ratcatcher, a terrific concept for a villain that only they can really pull off. And with that they finished 1987. But what about the Batman book? Well, that title was not doing so hot. Max Allan Collins was the new Batman writer after year 1, but only for about 5 months. He created new villains like the Mime and Ma-Gun, but his most important contribution was the new origin story for Jason Todd, the second Robin. Collins was responsible for giving Jason a new personality and a different background, which until then had only been a carbon copy of Dick Grayson's. Max Allan Collins was the only writer who cared about Jason Todd, giving him a good origin and decent stories. Unfortunately, when Collins' run ended, Jason was poorly written by everyone else. Max Allan Collins left the book as quietly as he had come. His short run was not bad, but it wasn't excellent either. Batman needed a creative team who could work together and deliver thrilling adventures and serious character studies, and that's why Denny O'Neil hired Jim Starlin as the writer and Jim Aparo as the artist. The Jims were a unique creative team. Starlin was a prolific comic book writer who had a long history with both DC and Marvel. He had worked in Batman before, so he was also familiar with the character. And what to say about Jim Aparo, who is still known as one of the definitive Batman artists of all time. A lot of modern folks don't appreciate him enough, and while I understand that his style is not that appealing to everyone, he was the most consistent Batman artist for almost 3 decades since the early 1970s. You gotta give him credit for that. In the late 1987, Batman 414 was published, marking the start of Aparo and Starlin's run. They brought back the dark elements that had been lost since 1986, such as serial killers and dangerous criminals, and only 2 issues later, they delivered one of the best Batman comics of the late 1980s. Batman number 416 is an extraordinary character exploration of Batman and his relationship with Dick Grayson, a terrific showcase of Starling's unique understanding of Batman and Nightwing. This one also features the first meeting of Dick Grayson and Jason Todd, making these one of those rare stories that you must read. By the end of 1987, the Batman comic ended with the first issues of Batman, 10 Nights of the Beast, one of the most iconic storylines of Starling and Aparo's run, which introduced the KG Beast to the Batman mythos. 1986 and 1987 was the time period when the modern Batman was shaped, and it was full of changes and drastic measures. There wasn't a single consistent creative team for the most part of 1986, and the teams that were actually consistent didn't last more than a year. The highlight of 1986 was without a doubt year 1, and the next big development was the introduction of 2 solid creative teams in the late 1987. Alan Grant, John Wagner and Norm Breyfogle in Detective Comics, and Jim Starlin and Jim Aparo in Batman. These are the creative teams that defined much of the late 80s in the Batman comics. And with that, we end this first episode of The Modern Bat. Let me know what do you think of this new series. I know that I already made videos for all the stories in this chapter, but I wanted to condense all that information in one video, just like the good old Golden, Silver and Bronze Bat series. I will try to continue the Modern Bat sometime in the future, but for now get ready for an entire season of the spooky videos that will happen this October. As always, a big thank you to my Patreons for keeping this dream alive. And the usual shout out to the 5 of you who still watch all the way to the end. Remember that you can always follow me on Twitter at Salazar. Friends, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.